Memorials dot the landscape of the Capitol's front lawn, honoring the significant contributions of Minnesotans to their state. That's next on Capitol Report. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Capitol Report program. I'm Julie Bartke. Minnesota's Capitol boasts a beautiful front yard filled with flowers, shrubs, and trees, and memorials dot the landscape as well. In this week's program, we're going to highlight some of those memorials, beginning with one that pays tribute to those who many call the greatest generation.
They were ordinary men and women charged with an extraordinary task: free the world from the grip of tyranny and oppression. World War II plunged the world into darkness and despair. Americans responded with an unprecedented war effort. From the battlefields of Europe and the seas and shores of the Pacific, to the factories, the volunteers, and the front yards of hometown USA, Americans came together like never before and sacrificed their way of life for a greater cause.
This was a world-changing event, and I think everyone understood that they were playing a small part in a huge global issue that had to be decided. And that's something that few other wars have really generated among the general populace.
It is in that spirit that Minnesota honors the men and women of the World War II generation. A humble generation, proud of their accomplishments, but uncomfortable with the praise and accolades of others.
Memorial was a piece to, of course, memorialize and honor the veterans of World War II, but specifically the Minnesota veterans. And so we were particularly interested in expanding on that side of the war, the kind of human involvement that the Minnesotans had. Both the Minnesotans who participated in the war throughout the world, but also here at home in Minnesota. So it told more about all of the participants in the war, not just the soldiers who were in combat or supporting combat.
We wanted to try and focus on the two different aspects of World War II. In our minds, there was sort of the big story, World War II all over the world, people from fighting all over the world. And then the other story was the individuals from the state of Minnesota who both fought in the war and helped prepare us for the war here.
Rich in symbolism, this spacious memorial brings together the anguish of war with the hope and ultimately the glory of victory. Surrounded by American elm trees and ringed with flowers, the heart of the memorial rests within its glass panels, which represent the experiences of Minnesota veterans as they traveled the perilous roads of war.
The glass panels are windows into different parts of this story. So they're windows into people's lives, people's experiences, and they begin to start telling that story as you're looking through these.
We were using phrases like, these are the windows into the lives of those veterans. So we wanted those to actually be initially, quotations from actual veterans who were fighting, and what did they remember about it, and what did they take away from their experience. As we went on through the process and talked to more and more veterans, it became apparent that they didn't want themselves to be sensationalized, or they didn't want to be called out as individuals.
But I think one of the main things that we tried to do in all those meetings over those years was not to make it significant for any individual person, and not to really have the entire monument and the memorial dedicated to the veteran. If you'll read on the scribed on the plaques that are out there, we all wanted the industry of Minnesota to be brought in, the fact that there was the citizens of Minnesota were involved, because I think each of us felt that it was a world war that involved everybody in the state, and that's what the memorial went to, and not just the fact that we were veterans.
It brings out not only the veteran, but the people of Minnesota, and it did not exclude the women, because it brings them in, the women of Minnesota that flew the planes, the women that worked in the arms plants and the munition plants. Every one of them is brought in here for this memorial.
The desire to remain anonymous, to resist the glory of individual accomplishments, is consistent of a generation of veterans that recognized a bigger picture of the war, a picture that included the hard work and sacrifice of the men and women back home.
Once war started, everything changed because of the need for all kinds of products, both military products and items to support the military, and a lot of those came from Minnesota. The Iron Range was booming, taconite was developed and fed the war effort. Even things like Spam, southern Minnesota pork production geared up so that luncheon meat could be provided to the soldiers. Science and industry boomed in Minnesota. The Norden bomb site, the C-1 autopilot from Sperry. There was a huge production of gliders right here in the Twin Cities, with parts being made in South Minneapolis and West St. Paul, and St. Paul assembled down at Wool Chamberlain Field into gliders and shipped overseas. So a tremendous amount of production, all different sorts of things, really caused a boom in business in Minnesota.
Minnesota felt the impact of war in other ways. Shortages and rationing had immediate impacts on the people. Conservation efforts ramped up, with the recycling of seemingly everything from aluminum products to tires and bubblegum wrappers. Minnesota's women not only tended their homes, they became a powerful force in the workplace and in the service.
Women served in all of the different branches of the armed forces with women's auxiliary forces. And on the home front, of course, once all the men, or most of the men, were in service in uniform and gone, there had to be people to fill that labor vacuum, and women did that. And saw a good bit of the outside world that they'd never seen before, and found that they could do very well in a whole different range of industries. There were a number who were pretty close to combat and did suffer casualties, and these were, for example, members of the Army Nurse Corps, frequently under fire, usually artillery fire, but they've lost casualties. They were very, very close to the front in field hospitals.
At the center of the memorial are two sculptural elements designed to tell a more general story. The sunken and raised earth plazas represent the highs and lows of the war.
Specifically, the lower plaza with the dark, cold, sharp granite was really meant to represent the lowest point of the war, the darkness, the death, the destruction. We intentionally designed that space so that people felt like they maybe shouldn't actually walk down in that space and be a part of it, but a space to be viewed from a distance and try and see it as something very different.
As you move through the memorial, you rise back up. The centerpiece, the symbol of the state, is at the center of this, and as you move past that, the ground rises back up. And it rises back up, symbolizing coming out of the depths of war into a symbol of peace and prosperity and openness again.
June 9th, 2007 was Dedication Day. The Capitol lawn, crowded with relic vehicles and other memorabilia, served as a gathering place for this very large Minnesota get-together. The hot, humid weather did not deter the thousands who came to honor and remember their friends, their comrades, parents or grandparents, or brothers and sisters. It was an opportunity to relive some of the sights and sounds of how they lived nearly a lifetime ago.
Now this has a catch. Just like the K98, you're going to push down the feeder tray first, and then you can go ahead and push it up a little bit. There you go.
And he went all across Europe from D-Day all the way to the surrender of Germany, and he never got a scratch.
important to remember the freedom that we have in this country and what it's taken to provide that freedom to us. And we tend to lose sight of that sometimes. And I think that these memorials help recognize those that have helped provide us with the opportunity to live in such a wonderful place as we do.
For the veterans of World War II, the memorial is a place for reflection. Thoughts of another lifetime and those who thrived within it give them pause. Those memories give way to more personal, sometimes painful experiences.
For me personally, when I look at the monument, immediately comes the fact that the recollection of my brother who entered the service in January of 1941 with the 1st contingent of Minnesota National Guard. He was killed in Okinawa on June 15th of 1945. When I look at the monument, I reflect his memories and all the times of our youth together. And I think everyone that's been in the service will look at it from different angles and different personal values.
We want to free the world. We knew there was a very vicious dictator over in Europe that was trying to take over the world. We saw what he did when we saw some of the camps where people died, and so I think everybody was proud of the fact that they were serving in the military.
Many stories have been told about the war, and many may never come to light, as the lifespan of an entire generation will soon run its course. Because of what they achieved, some have called them the greatest generation, and history suggests that may be correct. As these more personal stories are told, some will travel down to other generations, and some will just fade away. But the bigger story of the war, the soldiers, sailors, and airmen, doctors and nurses, the workers, the volunteers, the moms and dads and kids back home, that story will always be told at the Minnesota World War II Memorial.
Women were not granted the right to vote until the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1920. Minnesota ratified the amendment in 1919, but only after members of the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association spent decades pressing legislators to do so. The state now honors these women with a memorial on the Capitol lawn.
Resting on a quiet corner of Minnesota's Capitol Mall is the Women's Suffrage Memorial, a dedicated landmark that pays tribute to those Minnesotans involved in the long struggle over the right for women to vote and the promotion of informed and active citizenship. This beautiful garden combines an assortment of vivid flowers meant to symbolize the suffrage movement, with native plants and grasses and a rolling terrain, all meant to symbolize the Minnesota landscape. The garden lies in the shadow of a 90-foot-long metal trellis, within which are inscribed the names of Minnesota women most noted for their contributions to the suffrage movement. Alongside are plaques, including information about their accomplishments. This Minnesota memorial is the result of a national women's movement that can be traced back to mid-19th century New York.
The reason it started then was that the women who attended the convention had been denied access to the world. They were abolitionists. They had been denied access to, in London, to the World Anti-Slavery Meeting.
Women were denied access in London because they were women, and so their struggle became more about the right to own property and equality under the law than the right to vote.
Suffrage was not high on the list of what they wanted. There were so many ways in which women were disadvantaged in the 19th century. For example, when a man and a woman married, the two became one, and the one was the man, and she was his property. Well, and if they divorced, perish the thought, the man had custody of the children. So there were a lot of issues like that. And in fact, the idea of women voting was ridiculed.
As the years passed, the suffrage movement slowly gained national momentum. In Minnesota, the road leading to a constitutional amendment would prove to be long, and progress would come in small pieces.
In Minnesota, interestingly enough, I think, and Minnesota was not the only state, women got the right to vote first in school elections, and then 10 years later, in 1885, in library elections. Those were thought to be appropriate to women's roles.
From 1847 to 1919, resolutions and petitions were presented at the state capitol. None of them were successful. One call for a constitutional amendment was even laughed at on the House floor. Undeterred, women in Minnesota and elsewhere pressed on, with organized marches and rallies and persistent lobbying. Finally, on September 8, 1919, the Minnesota legislature ratified the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And on September 11th, it was signed into law. After 72 years, women had finally won the right to vote.
I would like it if more people went and looked at the memorial, saw it, and understood what a task it was to have it at all, and to get a sense of the roles of women in Minnesota.
The memorial is a tribute to those who were dedicated to a cause. Many did not live to see that cause become a reality, but their efforts are remembered in a beautiful little garden in the midst of a state capitol mall.
Minnesota's 12th governor was also the first to be born outside of the country. A Norwegian immigrant, Knut Nelson served in the Civil War as governor of Minnesota and went on to serve in the U.S. Senate. A statue outside of the Capitol stands as a reminder of his contributions to the state.
He was known as the grand old man of politics, a man whose lifelong career in public service would endear him to thousands of people throughout Minnesota. His statue rests prominently in front of the state capitol, a tribute to his accomplishments to state and country. Knut Nelson was a Norwegian immigrant who came to America with his mother when he was 6 years old. They settled in Wisconsin, where Nelson was determined as a young man to seek out an education.
The story his biographer tells is that he lived near an Albion Academy in Wisconsin, and he knocked on the door of the president and said, "How can I go to school even though I don't have money to go to school?" And the president was impressed and provided him with a free education for many years. In turn, he provided services to the school like carrying wood, etc., like that.
Nelson took a job as a country school teacher and later volunteered to join the Wisconsin 4th Regiment. He was wounded and taken prisoner during the Civil War. Upon returning home, he finished school, became a lawyer, and later served in the Wisconsin State Assembly. Shortly thereafter, Nelson moved his wife and child west to a farm in Alexandria, Minnesota, where his love of politics and public service began to fully emerge.
He almost immediately became the Douglas County attorney, so again he entered public service as well as working his farm. It was probably the basis for his long-term interest in the needs of farmers as well as labor. So throughout his career he was championing the causes of the farmers and the laborers, trying to get protection for the farmers for their prices. So he did work with, as governor of the state of Minnesota, to regulate grain and railroad industries. Another thing that he's known for is that in 1894, the Hinckley Fire was quite a disaster in Minnesota, killing, the 400 or so people. And he was able to spearhead the relief efforts that went to the survivors of that fire. He was also very interested in public lands. It really was the start of his interest in acquiring public land for state parks, which he continued in the U.S. Senate, but buying land for Itasca State Park was one of his accomplishments as governor.
Nelson's list of accomplishments were plenty and led to the honor that was ultimately bestowed on him.
The main statue is of him, obviously as serving as governor and U.S. senator for those many years. Then there are side assemblages, one including his mother and him. His mother is wrapped in a shawl, and he's a little boy, indicating his roots as a poor immigrant and rising to great political stature. And then the other is of him as a soldier.
As United States Senator, Nelson was noted for his work on bankruptcy law. As governor, he's remembered fondly for his contributions to the completion of the current state capitol building. His distinguished service as a state senator, congressman, governor, and U.S. senator endeared him to the citizens of the state.
At that period of time, he had completed his service to the United States, to Minnesota, and was the longest-serving United States senator from Minnesota. He served for 28 years, and that record of service has not been exceeded as yet. At that time, there was a groundswell of support to remember him. So not only did he have a portrait, the bust in the Senate, but there were contributions from all over the state to build a statue in his memory.
The likeness of Knute Nelson stands tall, overlooking the Capitol grounds, a statue that symbolizes his life and his work.
John Johnson first became governor of Minnesota in 1904. His charismatic personality and compromising disposition laid the foundation for his re-election in 1906 and again in 1908. As a politician who often worked across the political aisle, Johnson is remembered for his successful work on various types of reform legislation. A one-time Republican, Johnson was elected as a Democrat, once running for President of the United States. Here's a closer look at Minnesota's 16th governor.
John Johnson was born in St. Peter, Minnesota in 1861. The son of Swedish immigrants, he would grow up to become one of the state's most loved and respected governors. And because of his place and time in history, he would become known as a governor of firsts.
He was the first native-born Minnesotan to serve as a governor. He was the first to actually occupy a full term of office in the brand new Capitol after it opened in 1905. So he was elected in 1904, was inaugurated into the position in January of 1905 and served all the way until his death in 1909 in the state capitol. He was also the first to actually pass away as a governor in office in Minnesota history, and then the first to have a memorial dedicated on the brand new Capitol Mall.
The statue is not only a tribute to Governor Johnson's character and accomplishments, but it's also a symbol of the state's economy during the time in which he lived.
The idea of the other statues is to kind of incorporate what Minnesota was about in 1905, or when the building opened, also what Minnesota's industry was like. So it really focuses on farming. So one of the figures is a farmer, another one is a miner, another one is a lumber cruiser, which represents the lumbering industry, and also the manufacturing. So they are all representation of what Minnesota's industry was like at that time, and the importance of the economy and how we were becoming a very prosperous state at that time.
Johnson's rise to prominence in Minnesota was in large part due to a respect for his humble beginnings.
His mom was a washerwoman, his dad was a blacksmith. There was some alcohol problems with the father, and he eventually left the family and deserted John and his brothers and sisters, and so as a 13-year-old, he had to start working in a store to provide income for the family.
He developed a reputation in the community as a hard-working, likable man. After serving in the National Guard, he returned home and became co-owner and editor of the St. Peter Herald newspaper. A Republican at heart, his new venture soon offered him a different political perspective.
And that was a Democratic paper. And so I think because of being affiliated with that paper, he kind of looked more at the Democratic perspective and became more of a Democrat at that time.
Johnson liked politics, and after a few failed attempts, was elected to the state Senate. As a Democrat from St. Peter, he won in an overwhelmingly Republican district. Although he failed to win re-election, he'd proven he could win in a Republican district, a fact not lost on party leaders.
People started kind of throwing his name in there as a potential governor's candidate, and so he reluctantly, in a sense, was kind of drafted by the party to run as governor. And so he ran in the 1904 election, was elected, surprisingly, once again, as the governor of Minnesota. You have to remember, at that time, Minnesota was still a pretty strong Republican state. And so when John Johnson was running for the Minnesota governor's seat, he was basically the only one from the Democratic Party elected to official's office. And so he really was kind of a shining light for the Democratic Party at that time. And politically, he was seen as a real moderate, so he was able to work with both the Republicans and the Democrats as the governor of Minnesota.
Johnson came into office without a strong political agenda, but his gifted ability to reason with lawmakers opened the door to many reforms, including a reduction in passenger rail rates and changes in state insurance and tax codes, much of which benefited state citizens. After helping to end a labor strike on the Iron Range, Johnson's reputation in the public eye was further enhanced.
I think there was a genuineness to him, a sense that he could, as I said before, work with people of both parties. Of course, every political party is going to have their agendas and fight hard to get those things passed, but he was able to, work out the deals and the compromises. He was a leader for Minnesota. It wasn't one party or the other, so I think both parties, people in Minnesota saw what his character was like and the work he had accomplished as a governor.
At 48 years old, John Johnson died of complications after stomach surgery, the first Minnesota governor to die in office. Over 50,000 people came to pay their respects as he lay in state at the Capitol. Through all of his many accomplishments, fairness and character became noticeable attributes for John Johnson. His reputation as an honorable man helped secure both his political stature and his place in history.
It's now easier to stay in touch with activity at the state capitol. Senate Media Services is on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Find the links on our homepage. So follow us and follow the Senate. That concludes our look at some of the memorials that dot the Capitol lawn. From all of us at Senate Media Services, I'm Julie Bartke. Thank you for watching.